Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Well, there's something that I believe we all need to accept, and that is the fact that we've all been through some type of trauma. Really is true, whether you want to believe it or not. It may have happened way back in your childhood. It may have happened recently. Of course, we can define trauma in many different ways, but it's definitely something that can be holding you back from moving your life forward in all different areas, whether it's relationships, jobs, you have beliefs that don't support you anymore. We've got somebody that can certainly help you out with all of that. And she's got many different modalities to get that done. She's with wholebrainbalancing.com, and she is Paula Chiarmonte, and she's on the program today. Paula, welcome. How you doing?
I'm well. Thanks very much. How are you doing, Steve?
Doing well, doing well. And in my journey currently, that's lasted the last 2 years, started figuring all this stuff out that we're about to talk about. And wow, it all makes sense when you start connecting the dots to a trauma. Could have been in your childhood, stuck in your subconscious, could be something you recently went through, maybe divorce or a change of job that, kind of change things for you. And you're somebody that helps people with all of that. And it's almost like if I have this right, a 3-tier approach. You have 3 different ways that you can help people. Tell us more about that.
Sure, thank you. Well, whole brain balancing is a holistic approach to really integrative health, which would be body, mind, brain, spirit. And first of all, I'd just like to give a quick introduction of my background.
Sure.
I'm actually a preferred facilitator with Psych-K. I've been doing this work for over 10 years, since 2013. That's sort of the equivalent of a certification. And I have a master's degree and a publication record. I'm also certified in transformational healthcare leadership from UCLA. And my most recent studies are in trauma healing with Thomas Hubel, who's now really renowned in this field. And it was after practicing Psych-K for almost 8 years that I really became involved with trauma healing, because obviously COVID, right? We all experience this collective trauma. So that's some of my background. I've had several other careers. This is my encore career. So let me just kind of give you the bird's eye view of whole brain balancing. It started out with Psych-K. That's really my core practice. So it's the purpose of whole brain balancing, broadly speaking, is to cultivate emotional healing, psychological growth, and spiritual awareness. So it really is pretty comprehensive. And so the first modality of the 3, excuse me, is Psych-K, which, as you know, you're familiar with it. It generates self-empowerment, peak performance by transforming these self-limiting beliefs held in the subconscious mind, usually from childhood. And so that's how we address the mind. And then the second modality is trauma healing, which really addresses the body, because as we were talking about earlier, there's a kind of locking trapped energy that occurs when we experience trauma in many areas of our field, mostly our brain and muscle memory. And so the objective of trauma healing is to renew the self-compassion that we lost and to restore healthy relationships, because it's usually what's mostly affected by trauma, healthy relationships with ourselves and others. And then DNA activation is a little different. It's we're working at the cellular level with DNA directly, and we're addressing the ancestral origins of these self-limiting beliefs that are usually passed down when they're unresolved in the intergenerational genetic stream. So it's really a very big picture approach to body, mind, and spirit. I think that's the easiest way to describe it. And I can amplify, and I plan to amplify on all 3.
So many questions. And I want to get back to the cellular level in a moment, because I find it fascinating, and I just started learning more about that. But when somebody reaches out to you and they're stuck, or they have what they feel is a limiting belief, and they just can't move life forward, and they can't figure it out, how does it begin with you? How do you make that decision to go either this direction for Psych-K or that direction? How do you determine that?
Mm-hmm. And so you're asking specifically about how we kind of move into working with the psyche modality when somebody's aware of their self-limiting beliefs.
Let's start. They're not. They just. I
Yeah,
feel
well,
lost.
because
I don't know
most
what's
people
going on.
aren't.
Yeah.
I mean, who really considers these things? They're just so internalized, so let's, I think it'd be helpful to start maybe with a couple of very simple definitions,
Sure.
because one thing that I don't think is helpful is to talk about how does it work, like what's the technique. That's on my website, wholebrainbalancing.com. I don't think that's very helpful. What's more important, I think, is to get kind of a big picture, and your question is a good one. So a couple of terms relative to psyche I'd like to share right at the outset are the following, and I'll amplify briefly. One of them is epigenetics. And we all know Dr. Bruce Lipton is the godfather of epigenetics. He discovered it back in the 70s. Another important definition or concept are beliefs, right? And epigenetics and beliefs have this sort of symbiotic relationship. We also want to talk about the subconscious mind's power compared to the conscious mind's power. And in addition, there's a term called psychological kinesiology, which is what the acronym Psych-K stands for. Psych, P-S-Y-C-H-K. And it's a very unusual term, right? But it actually is an acronym that stands for psychological kinesiology. And I'll amplify on that briefly. Let's see, the final and actually most important term would be the whole brain state. The whole brain state, because Psych-K is fundamentally a brain integration technique that also is a deep change method that works with the subconscious mind. And those two events are what I guess I'll be working backwards. Those two events are what constitute, or they're outcomes of being in the whole brain state. And so when somebody is drawn to Psych-K, whether through Bruce or through their own suffering from distress, they are going to be experiencing in the session the whole brain state. They will re-regulate their brainwaves by bringing into balance the two hemispheres of their brain, which come out of balance, become imbalanced through trauma. Unfortunately, it's one of the effects. We can start to overuse one side of our brain. Many people are familiar with the fact that we have two brain hemispheres, left and right. Left is functioning, its function is more analytical. Right brain, its function is more emotional or intuitive. They're kind of like the yin and yang of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole brain state, is a very important basic concept to understand about the outcomes of doing Psych-K. And that's sort of like what occurs, this brainwave re-regulation, the hemispheres become balanced. The second thing that occurs, the subconscious and conscious minds can communicate more easily than normally. They can't communicate well. Actually, the subconscious mind acts like a gatekeeper. It's designed to keep that programming from childhood stable and static. And so we need like keys to unlock it. And the key that we use in Psych-K is this technique. It's called psychological kinesiology. In plain English, it means muscle testing. Many people are familiar with muscle testing. We work with the central nervous system, of course, which includes the brain, to calibrate these electrical signals that come off of the nervous system. And through directly contacting the subconscious mind, we get responses, yes, no, binary responses from statements, and you're probably familiar with it. So that's about the extent of the technique that I'm going to describe. But the whole brain state is a really important event or concept to understand. And then psychological kinesiology is another term that I think is helpful to talk about. The role of the subconscious mind as opposed to the conscious mind. Subconscious mind accounts for 95% of what really motivates us. That's why we say the results of a Psych-K balance align subconscious motivations with conscious intentions, whereas normally there's a tension there, and we think they're aligned, but they're not, because the subconscious mind is like the bottom of the iceberg. it's the 800-pound gorilla, in our awareness. And so if we're seeking self-empowerment and peak performance, ultimately we need to address the subconscious mind. Now, what's helpful, and I'll get to epigenetics in a minute and beliefs, it's helpful to understand that there are many deep change techniques. Probably the most common are tapping, right? Emotional freedom technique, EFT, and EMDR, rapid eye movement, used by traditional psychotherapists. There are many more. Hypnotherapy, I mean, that's about all. Those are the only examples I'm going to provide. They're all valid. I've used them all. However, what we're looking for is our next generation solutions. We live in a high-tech society. We're always looking for the next version to work smarter, not harder. And it's the same thing with mental health. Why should it be any different? Why should we be stuck in these old paradigms when there is a virtual global mental health crisis occurring, mostly as an outgrowth from the collective trauma that we experience with COVID? So we're looking to sort of push the envelope. Like, how can we access the subconscious mind quickly, easily? How can we get enduring change at that level of the mind that is easy, that's accessible, that's affordable, most importantly, for people today? And so the subconscious mind, really is the key here. Let me take a moment to get back to epigenetics, and then we can proceed, because you may have more questions. So to kind of get back to your question, most people, after they've seen a video or they've read something, and I do invite visiting my website. I'm a former research analyst, librarian, bibliographer. I mean, I'm very detailed. When I need to understand something, I really have to plumb it. And so a lot of the research I've done is on my website. And further, I've also studied and practiced neurofeedback, which is a more clinical and technical approach to brainwave regulation. So, on my website, I compare neurofeedback with this form of biofeedback, which is really what Psych-K is, because it uses this muscle testing. So anyway, back to epigenetics. So Psych-K is like the practical application of Dr. Bruce Lipton's epigenetics, which basically just means the environment determines our biology and our beliefs far more than our ancestral DNA. And I don't need to get into all the technicalities, but the environment, what constitutes the environment are many things. Two of the biggest are our family influences and our cultural influences. Our family influences can show up as ancestral trauma, and that's where the sort of segue goes into trauma. And our cultural influences, all the institutions that influence our lives, can be reflected in collective trauma. And that's sort of how I got into extending my training beyond Psych-K into trauma, because it just seemed like you have to look at this phenomenon because it's such an important driver. And so epigenetics, it's really not that complicated. It just means that, our cells are responding to the environment. Over 95% of the cellular response is to the environment. It's not from our ancestral DNA. That's why Bruce always reminds us, most diseases, less than 1%, are caused by our DNA. It's the environment that's key.
You would think otherwise based on what you hear.
Because science is king, right? And, who really, as we started, our conversation, who really talks about beliefs? They're just so intrinsic. We just kind of presume, but beliefs really are one of the more important environmental. Let's really look at them for a moment. One of the more important environmental influences, obviously directly from our families and directly from these institutional influences as well, but it's the subconscious beliefs. And that's where I think there's some hesitation, perhaps on some people's part. Maybe they affiliate or connect the subconscious mind with some Freudian concepts from 125 years. That's really kind of like ancient history. That we know so much more about the subconscious mind. We know how to work with the subconscious mind. It's not that sort of mysterious, misunderstood part of the human experience that it was in the late 19th century. So I think that demystifying through maybe defining these terms is helpful. And I think it's also really helpful for us to learn to own our biology, to begin to understand our brain, to understand the different aspects of the mind, subconscious, conscious, superconscious. It's really not that complicated. I mean, all
No.
we have to do is, be open-minded and be curious.
And accept it. And what we said, out of the gate is you suffered trauma, when you were a child. I believe, and this is, based on my research, and I'm not the expert, far from, we all got something. We all dealt with something in our childhood. Some of us this. And when people hear the word trauma, they have this view of just like this catastrophic event that took place. No, you could have been walking by the kitchen. Your parents are having a conversation. You heard a comment, you internalized it, had nothing to do with you. And then you kept that with you all of your life. And until you go into your subconscious, or somebody like you does and pulls it out. I want to go back to something you said about genetics. And in terms of us having disease, illness, and all of that, you said it's about 1% that is genetics, the rest is environmental. That being said, when we say environmental, are we saying that the emotional stuff we deal with in life and the, call it the toxins we put in our body, go to the supermarket and grab an apple. If it's not organic, you're putting toxins most likely in your body, all of that stuff put together. Is that where you're going with that in terms of what determines when we get sick or we have a disease?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, I think it's because, science is wonderful, but it's a pretty young discipline. It's only really, modern science is only about 300 years old. And so of course we want to learn from it. It's the same with modern medicine. However, these are times when we're breaking through the old paradigms, when we're really seeking to understand what are the actual drivers with my beliefs and my biologies, and for the rest of humanity for that matter. And it does sort of shake up your worldview. I mean, it's probably not what you learned in biology class 20 or 30 years ago,
Mhm.
but that's the beauty of these pioneering cell biologists like Bruce Lipton. They help to shape new paradigms.
It's a shame that more is not said about all of this, your subconscious. We don't really learn about that in school when we're, going through high school and all of that. But we should, and even you go to your doctor now, you have some challenges, you're dealing with stress, emotion, thing, whatever it might be. Your doctor's never going to turn around to you for the most part. I'm talking traditional doctor, primary care physician, and say, Dad, you know what? This is probably something goes back to your childhood, and it's something that you might have experienced with. No, they're going to say,
Yeah.
let me write you a script, let me send that in to you, and you're good to go.
Well, yeah. Steve, I think it's because, according to Thomas Hubel, trauma's been normalized. That's a really important thing to face and understand. Trauma in our culture and on our planet has been normalized, and we have to stop normalizing it. 2/3 of all adults experience trauma in childhood.
That's what I'm
60,
talking about.
yeah,
Yeah.
67%. I mean, that and growing, of course, right? Because of obvious factors. So
Well, also awareness. Now we're talking about it. Now it seems to be, I think, post-COVID, and just my view that we're more open to seeing these things. And what you said before, very powerful. Many of us don't consider the COVID situation that we went through a couple of years ago a trauma. It was a trauma. We're still dealing with it. It was, look at how people's lives have changed, or people made decisions in their lives coming out of that, because it was, I call it the rock in the pond. That COVID was splashed the water in the pond, the ripples went out, people made decisions. I'm getting divorced. Okay. I'm changing my job. I'm going to do this. It was a big shakeup, but with all of that is the collateral damage, i.e., the trauma that we suffered.
yeah, it was just a colossal reset, which could have both positive and negative impacts. But what it really caused was isolation, And isolation is what occurs with trauma, whether it's individual, ancestral, collective. I mean, trauma fragments and disempowers, and those are terms from Thomas Hubel. Trauma fragments and disempowers our relationships with ourselves and with others. Fragments and disempowers. I mean, that's kind of a frightening thought. And so, the isolation that was sort of the agenda, in my view, for COVID just completely exacerbated, the stressors that we're living with in these very transformational and turbulent times.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's momentous when you look at our population. What a difference it would be if we all realized all of this stuff and sought some help for it. So can we talk about muscle testing when it
Sure.
comes to Psych-K?
Sure.
I have some knowledge of it. I find it fascinating, but I try to practice it myself on a basic level. And correct me if I'm wrong here in terms of Psych-K. One of the, muscle testing techniques is, thank you. Yeah. Where you say it true. Do that again, because I was doing it wrong.
Well, we just take our, what's it, index and thumb on
Right.
both.
The okay sign.
The okay sign. And then we use one of them as like a pincer, and we try to pull through the other little O. And
Right.
if we break that contact, that's a weak, that's a no. If it stays, if the electrical connection stays, then that's a yes, that's a strong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in terms of, muscle testing individually on our own, there, of course, there's some subjectivity at play. I mean, even Rob suggests, it's really better to have someone else do the muscle testing, especially for Psych-K, because it's a very precise, sequence of activities in Psych-K.
How do you do it? So what's the difference between an individual doing it or you facilitating it?
Well, and that kind of, I think, brings up a really important practical point, which is how Psych-K is sort of delivered, because amazingly, which most people are shocked to hear, Rob brought in Psych-K in 1988. That is almost 35 years ago, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
And people are,
it's hard to believe.
It truly is hard to believe. But the point is, we've always been trained by him to do the muscle testing remotely online using a method called surrogation. It's a very simple method in working in the quantum field. Now, when COVID hit and Zoom became the norm of communicating online, like everybody was doing like energy work, right?
Right.
Who knows if they were actually, doing surrogation? But we have a very specific method called surrogation that we can do the sessions remotely online. Or we can also, do the sessions in person. And you probably have seen the video where with Psych-K, the method is to hold your arm out to the side, and then we press down on the wrist, just because it gives more exposure up the entire arm to the brain and the central nervous system.
And you're more vulnerable, I find this, I try to do this and I really want it to work.
Yeah.
and I try not to fight it and just get it naturally in giving a yes and a no response. And I'll do baselines, my name is Steve Harper, whether I can break that chain, and then I'll have a false statement. I find myself challenged. I've even done the sway test, right? Where you stand up and you give yourself true and false questions to see which way you sway for the yes and the no. But I get what you're saying. If you're in person working with somebody, you're saying somebody puts their arm out and then you're trying to push down on it, correct?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I feel that you're much more vulnerable here. It's hard to control this. It's hard to control this.
Right. And there's just more exposure to the central nervous system.
Sure.
Than just this little area of the body, right?
Yep. Yeah. Do you find, on an individual level, if somebody wants to just kind of baseline test themselves, that this is effective? Maybe it's just me. Maybe I need to, clear my
honestly,
mind a bit.
I really, I wouldn't like internalize that too much, because it's really practice. Honestly,
Okay.
Practically, it's like anything. It's just practice. I've been doing muscle testing 40 years. So
okay. Yeah. Well, you have that feeling. Same thing with the gut feeling. what you feel for your gut feeling, your intuition might be different than what I feel. But once you learn to trust it and
Right.
realize it, then you just go from there. Every once in a while you might test it a little bit. But you got it internally, you figured it out. So I'm still trying to figure that part out. But it is exciting. I mean, this is, what this can do to help people, the traumas that we deal with. And again, back to the beginning, we all have dealt with trauma. It is what it is. And it is holding us back in many regards from moving our life forward.
Yeah. Well, I think that, it's important, excuse me, on a final note, just to recognize that our options really haven't been that extensive. The traditional approach, I mean, with all due respect to modern psychiatry, et cetera, psychotherapy, what have our choices been? It's been either talk therapy or medication. I mean, those aren't really it's not a very extensive menu.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. In today's healthcare world, because of the mental health crisis, go Google it, it's going on, that most practitioners don't even have the time. So the psychiatrist that somebody talks to once a month just listens for 5 minutes, mostly on the phone or virtual, and then sends the script in or changes it. And that's it. Doesn't get to the core. They just, write the script, and that's it.
Yeah, and the method, rapid eye movement, it's questionable. I mean, the research indicates that, the efficacy of that method is questionable. So I think the bottom line, is our humanity is profoundly rich, right? Our body, our mind, our brain, our spirit. We need to learn how to harness these incredible potentials that we have, whether it's from our DNA, the intricacy of the neuroplasticity capacity of our brain, the incredible beauty of our emotional spectrum, down to the awesome complexity of our biology, not to mention our spirituality. I mean, these are vast frontiers that are just beginning to be exposed and beginning to be optimized. So we have to keep pushing the envelope. I mean, what else can we do? We're not going to go backwards, right? We have to keep pushing forward. And this is, I think, the beauty and the challenge of the times that we live in.
Agreed. It has to become, if we want to use that term, the new norm, post-COVID. This stuff has to be more of a new norm. But we're getting there. I feel we're making, thanks to COVID, if you will, there's more awareness of all of this, and that's helped us. For you, your website is wholebrainbalancing.com, right?
Right. Yes. And I just invite people, visit the website. There's a lot of information. Of course, I offer a complimentary phone consultation.
Okay.
It's very easy to learn about psyche, trauma healing, DNA activation. And I just want to thank you for this interview. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you about it. I appreciate all your very insightful questions.
Oh, Paula, there's so much more, and I'm not going to, no pun intended here when I say I really want to continue to pick your brain. I really mean that. Because there's so much more, talking about EFT and all the other modalities. But it's nice to get some deep insight on all of this. And you're here to help people. And that's what it's all about. You have the passion for it. So I look forward next time we get together.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Paula. Wholebrainbalancing.com. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.